Today's guest is Lauren K. Johnson. Lauren grew up in a military family in the Seattle area. She went to serve as an Air Force public affairs officer and award-winning Department of Defense journalist, deploying to the Republic of Mali and Afghanistan. After receiving an honorable discharge, Lauren earned an MFA in creative writing at Emerson College in Boston. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Glamour, and other publications, and she has lectured at schools, conferences, and veteran centers across the country, including the Association of Writers and Writing Programs National Conference, the Boston Book Festival, and the University of Iowa. She's a writing consultant for Grub Street and, by day, works for Ignite Worldwide, a nonprofit that aims to combat the gender imbalance in STEM fields. She lives with her husband and 2-year-old twin daughters in Seattle. Her memoir, The Fine Art of Camouflage, was published by Millspeak Books, in March of this year. Lauren K. Johnson, welcome to Next Steps Forward.
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here.
So before we start, that was 2/3 of a page of an intro for you. How do you do all this? You got a book, you've got a career, you've got twins, a couple of nonprofit jobs.
I ask myself that question multiple times a day. How do I do this? And sometimes, why do I do this? And it would be nice to just step back and take a breath sometimes. But, I also am really energized by just being busy and don't do well when I'm sitting still. So I guess it kind of suits me. And it also didn't all happen at once. It kind of came late to the game with having a family and took a very circuitous route to get to a career that I enjoy. And this book has been 12 years in the making. So it all just kind of converged a couple years ago, but in the best possible way.
And before the show, we both shared a cup of coffee that gets us through the day. So that certainly helps as well. So, your book chronicles your coming of age against the backdrop of war, beginning with your mother's Army career and deployment in support of Operation Desert Storm when you were 7 years old, and later with your own service in Afghanistan. Can you tell me a bit about your mother's military service?
Yeah, absolutely. My mother retired after 22 years in the Army, predominantly in the Army Reserves. She retired as a lieutenant colonel, so she's quite the stud, and served as an Army nurse, first active duty for a few years and then went reserves. And a main reason why she went reserves is because she wanted to have a family and she wanted to have stability. And in that era, the late 80s, early 90s, the reserves promised that. And specifically the unit that she chose, a massive hospital unit in the Seattle area with 750 personnel. It was one of those things at the time where everybody said, "Oh, we're too big and too expensive to deploy. So, you'll get stability here. You'll never leave Seattle." And it sounds like a B movie I'm setting up. Dun dun dun. What's going to happen next? And as from that intro, my mom did end up deploying. She was activated to deploy in support of Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, on right after Thanksgiving weekend of 1990. And I was 7 years old at the time. My sister turned 9 while my mom was gone, and my brother was barely 2. So young family kind of thrust into this deployment experience that we weren't expecting, and that at the time had so much unknown swirling around it. We look back now at Desert Storm, and it was a relatively quick and decisive conflict, but it didn't feel that way at the time. And my mom actually thought it might be a suicide mission with the threat of chemical warfare and the potential for Israel getting involved. So it was a much bigger thing, just full of uncertainty and stress at the time than the kind of gift of hindsight as we look back now. But overall, my mom enjoyed her military career. She calls it a blip, the few months where she was in Saudi Arabia in support of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. And, that was understandably a very challenging time for our family. And when she got home, we all made a family pact that no one else would join the military because one deployment was enough. So again, with the B movie thing, what's going to happen next?
And we'll get to that in a moment. While you're talking, I realize we've had a lot of veterans on the show here, but you might be the first person we've had on as both a veteran and child of a veteran. I know you're 7 years old at the time, but when your mother was deployed to war, what were you thinking? What was going through your mind with you, your siblings?
As a 7-year-old, a lot of it was just a very emotional reaction. My mom and I have always been very close. She was my person. So having her very suddenly plucked from my life was unsettling in a lot of ways. And it was an interesting era because deployments were so, it wasn't a predictable thing like it is if you join the military in this era. And because my mom was a reservist, we didn't live on a base. She was by and large a part-time soldier. So she would go to drill weekends, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year. And by and large, we were just a normal young family. And she was driving our carpools to school and going on field trips with us and carting us around to a variety of activities. So having her leave just thrust us into this whole new routine. My dad suddenly was a single parent, working full time. He commuted to downtown Seattle from the suburbs, so he was gone for 12 hours a day. And we would go to neighbors' houses and friends' houses before and after school, had a lot of community support. The community really rallied around us, perhaps in part because we were the only local family impacted. But being the only local family impacted also felt like a big spotlight was on us. And it felt very isolating being the only person going through this. So it's kind of a weird double-edged sword. I was very emotional. I saw the school counselor for a few weeks. I cried almost every night in bed. My mom recorded herself reading us bedtime stories. And every time that tape ended, I just burst into tears. That was kind of just the way I processed things as a 7-year-old. My sister was, of course, impacted, but expressed emotions differently. So that's one of the things I explored and kind of played with as I was writing, was just the way that we're impacted both internally and how we express that externally, and then looking at how does that play out in our adult lives, and why was I, who was so overtly impacted and so open with my emotions and my distress about my mom going on, why then did I end up being the one to join the military?
Is that where you go, dun, dun, dun?
Yeah, exactly. Dun, dun, dun.
Your mom wasn't the only family member to serve in the military before you. You're from a military family, but plenty of people in military families, and especially women, do not go on to join the armed forces. What inspired your mother to join the military, and what motivated her throughout her service?
My mom and I are alike in so many ways, and we actually have a lot of connections in the reasons we joined. We both, I went through ROTC, and my mom went through a similar program. So you're a college student while you're receiving military training. It's basically like a college class, and you do some lab work where you're focused on learning how to be an officer. And we both joined at 18, when we were young and naive and a little headstrong and asserting our independence. And we both had full scholarships, which is a very alluring thing when you're 18. So my mom loved many things about that experience, as did I. The opportunities to be a leader and to work with a group of people who are like-minded and working towards similar goals and something greater than yourself. I think we both just inherently have that desire to serve within us. She expressed that as a nurse, and then as a nurse in the Army. I expressed that joining the military, and in my day job now, working for a nonprofit. We just both kind of are in our element when we're supporting other people, and the military was one vehicle we chose to do that.
What were some of the challenges or sacrifices your mother faced while serving the military?
Obviously, the deployment is the big one. Leaving your young family for what for her was an undetermined length of time. She had orders for up to 2 years, and however long they needed her, she was committed to being there. So with a young family at home, she was thinking, I have a 2-year-old. I'm gone for 2 years. He's not going to remember me. I can't even now, as a mother myself with 2-year-olds, I can't even fathom what that must have felt like. But beyond that, she was a woman in the military in an era where, even now, it's still challenging in a lot of ways to be a woman in the military. And she entered right after the dissolution of the draft, and the military was kind of desperate for volunteer bodies, regardless of their gender. So she kind of came in a wave of other folks doing that. And in her deployment to Desert Storm was part of the largest contingent of women to serve in a conflict, 40,000 women. She tells stories about how when she was applying for her scholarship to go essentially go to nursing school with the Army, that she was asked questions about, do you have a serious relationship? And, what if you fall in love and want to get married? And just kind of this, not so subtle undertone, like, we want you to be married to the Army. We don't want you to be committed to other relationships in your life because we want you to be, at our whim, essentially. And she actually, when she got pregnant with my sister, they didn't have maternity uniforms available. This was the 80s. So, women had been serving. I mean, if you look back in history, women have been serving in armed conflicts as long as men have, sometimes dressing as men in order to be able to serve in that capacity. And as a nurse, that's the first official capacity when women were authorized to serve. So it's mind-boggling to me that in the late 80s, they didn't have Army nursing maternity uniforms available. But it's like turning the Titanic around. It's, culture changes, and we're still very much going through that in a lot of ways.
I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago about your mother signing up after the draft was done away with. So you highlight that we are now the All-Volunteer Force. And I think we just had the 50th anniversary of it last year. And General George Casey, retired Army Chief of Staff, and Dr. Joel Cooper Smith are doing some work at Georgetown on what that next 50 years of the All-Volunteer Force looks like. And they're talking about things like, the Gen X and Gen Z. It's just a different mindset today in terms of looking to serve something greater than yourself and, God, country, core type of mentality. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what you think the military should do generically and in general in terms of supporting and encouraging the all-volunteer force going forward.
That's a really great question, and something that I spent a decent amount of time thinking about. And it's one of the interesting dynamics in this era of service, because I think gratefully we've gotten to a point as a nation where most people are able to separate the conflicts from the people engaging in the conflicts. So you look at the Vietnam era, those folks weren't volunteering. They were drafted, they were sent to a place where many of them didn't want to go, doing things many of them didn't want to be doing. And they came home and were spat on and called baby killers. Now we're in an era where every single person who joins is doing so of their own volition. And yet we come home and there's, by and large, a positive reception and gratitude. And it's almost like the pendulum has swung a little far in that direction, and it's become platitudes and, thank you for your service, which, while it is meaningful, it is mostly surface level for a lot of folks. And there's a lot of detachment because it's a volunteer only era. And I know a lot of services are struggling to meet their recruiting goals right now, and different mindsets of generations, and as the political things being what they are, and tensions, and a very, very polarized nation in a lot of ways, it's a challenging thing to navigate. The military is supposed to be representative of your society, and when we look at the demographics, it really is mostly specific groups of people who are joining. And in order to, I think, continue to serve this country in the way that the military theoretically wants to, and needs to, in order to have the support that they need to continue with an all-volunteer force, there needs to be some culture changes there as well. And there's still, as I mentioned, a lot of challenges in being a woman serving. Women make up almost 20% of the active duty force at this point. And we still have to deal with issues of harassment and military sexual trauma and assault, and these horrible things that women and men are subject to, and people of different identities and different gender representations. And the military has kind of historically not been very welcoming to folks who represent different perspectives like that. So there's a lot of, I think we're in a convergence zone, and there's some big cultural changes that need to take place in order for it to really be an environment that encourages different types of people and different perspectives to join. And those are the perspectives that we need in order to, make informed, nuanced decisions and lead people effectively and holistically. So that wasn't really an answer. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that it's a big problem. And I hope that there are smart, dedicated people working to solve it.
Well, no, I threw a curveball at you, and I think my third cup of coffee maybe be a little more of a deep thinker this afternoon. But I loved your response in terms of how you said the military is supposed to be indicative and reflective of your country's makeup. And you said it's not. And as you talk about women being 20% and then other identities, we'll call them, in terms of, representing the population, to your point, the military is the Titanic or big oil tanker in the sea turning around. And it just takes time for those policy changes to take effect. But having people like yourself out there talking about them, I think that's a big shot in the arm for the process. And I appreciate you bringing up military sexual trauma. That's something that I have a lot of focus on in the nonprofit work that I do. And it's something obviously that is typically swept under the rug by the military for obvious reasons. But one thing I recently learned, and I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but apparently military bases are also very engaged in human trafficking, which I had no idea about. So that's also been a big focus for the show. We've had a lot of survivors on and talking about that. And that's something that I had my eyes blind and closed for decades on, and now have made that a big focus. And so just thinking about things, you think about the military being, rah, rah, let's go get them. But there's a lot of things behind the scenes, behind the curtain that need to be addressed. I won't say they need to be fixed, but they certainly need to be addressed.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of a tricky thing. I mean, it's like, there's a lot of controversy around the police force right now. And these are organizations that, in name and in, kind of an idealistic mindset are supposed to represent the best of us and supposed to be, leaders and examples and model exemplary behavior and take care of people. And in reality, it's a group of humans and governed by, some of the biggest bureaucratic organizations in the world. So there's problems that inevitably come out of that, especially when it's a culture that kind of feeds off that hyper masculinity and in a lot of ways by necessity. In a job where you have to be prepared to make life and death decisions and to protect yourself and to protect the men and women around you, it just doesn't translate into that normal environment or that caretaking environment that it is expected to, perhaps unfairly or unrealistically in a way. So it's this weird double-edged sword, but it is in a lot of ways a microcosm of society and particularly that hyper-masculine piece. So yeah, there's a lot of concerns about rage and about power and those dynamics really, kind of fester under the surface until suddenly they explode.
And we're way off topic here, and I love when this happens because we've gone on a rabbit hole. But just one thing on policing. So my listeners know I'm getting my doctorate and focusing on job-related PTSD not being treated for police officers. And recently read a white paper, because that's what you do when you write a dissertation, you read white papers. But this researcher said, and actually highlighted, that everyone has a bad day, but police officers see everyone's bad day every day. And it's something I wouldn't think about. You just think there's construction down the street from me, as they're managing traffic and, maybe some petty theft at the grocery store or something. But no, there's suicides and gang things and drugs and human trafficking and sexual trauma and just all these things. And hats off to the men and women who do that. I know, to your point, there's a big controversy in terms of what's going on, whether it's defund the police or something else. But just something that in the back of the mind that just sticks in terms of like how they wake up every day and put on the shoes, their pants, their belt buckle, their gun and their badge, and off they go. And you don't know what's going to happen when they get that call. All right, let's focus back on Lauren, if that's okay.
Of course.
So without giving away too much that's in your book, would you share a memorable story or experience that your mother shared about her time in the military?
We've talked a lot, really, since I got back from Afghanistan. That was kind of a turning point in our relationship in a way where we were able to open up in new ways to each other. As I said, we've always been close, but as a child, and I have a new appreciation for this now as a parent, you have to be mindful of what you're sharing with your children, and this desire to protect your kids. And of course, that's a big issue in and of itself. What does that mean? How can I protect but not shelter, and own the responsibility of and the privilege of whatever position you're born into. But my mom, since I've gotten back, has been much more open with me about her experience, and we found a lot of connections, even though our service was separated by generations, and we served in different areas and in different roles. She was Army, I was Air Force. But some of the things I love hearing her talk about are her role in a very interpersonal way when she was in Saudi Arabia, and some of the specific patients that she worked with. She worked in a Saudi Arabian hospital, and a lot of the patients that she cared for were Iraqi nationals. So they were prisoners of war sometimes, or they were injured Iraqi nationals who would come to the hospital. And she was initially afraid to treat them because she had internalized this fear of them as the other. And she met them and she said, oh, they were just puppy dogs. And she just kind of fell in love with them in a way, and learned that their stories were not so different from a lot of the folks that she worked with, the Americans that she worked with, or that they were fighting because of intimidation and threats against their family. So kind of moving beyond that perception of reality, and getting to the human to human connections that come through an experience like war, because really at its core, that's what it's about. It's a human experience.
Let's expand on that a little bit more if we can. I'd like to ask the same questions about your military service, beginning with, how did your mom's military service and experience influence your own perspective on patriotism, service, or military life?
That's a great question, and definitely something that I explored in writing this book. When I signed my ROTC contract, it was my senior year of high school and just a couple months after 9/11. So looking at that on paper, it seems like 9/11 was a big motivating factor, and it was definitely part of it. But as I dug into it more, I realized there's a lot of layers that get into my history coming from a military family. My mom was a huge part of that. My mom was my hero. And then when she deployed, she kind of elevated her hero status. I mean, I basically built her up to be this, mythological goddess, and really, really admired her. And so when 9/11 occurred, I was born and raised in Seattle, so we didn't have that immediate impact that folks in your area may have experienced. It was more detached because we were on the West Coast. We had the buffer of geography. But for me, what really struck me was the patriotic swell in the country, which felt very similar to the reception that my mom received when she came home from Desert Storm. And it was just this, we're all in this together. We're united in a noble cause. And I specifically remember, and there's actually a scene in my book that captures my feelings driving back home from school, the afternoon of 9/11, and there were people lining the streets with signs and waving American flags, and I just found myself honking. I wasn't even aware of what I was doing. I was just cheering and just caught up in it. And then Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA came on the radio, and that song came out during Desert Storm and had been an anthem for my mom's unit. And I don't know how long it had been since I heard it, but everything kind of converged on me in that moment. And it was like something inside of me awakened. And I really think it was this latent patriotism, that, this desire to do what my mom had done, to do what my grandfathers had done, to be part of something noble like that. And then, of course, there was always the promise of a full ride scholarship to my dream school on the beach in California, being 18 and naive. So there are a lot of factors, but having the mother that I, really wanted to follow in her footsteps in a lot of ways was a huge part of that.
And do you feel like you were better prepared for any of the experiences or challenges you encountered because your mom served?
I think I was better prepared for being a woman in that environment. She did talk pretty openly about some of her experiences with harassment and actually encouraged me to join the Air Force as opposed to the Army, in large part because of that. So the Air Force has a higher percentage of women, and in her perspective, tends to be a little more welcoming, and didn't have as many severe issues with harassment. Of course, still many. There's things that come up about the service academies, regularly with issues of sexual assault. So definitely still a present issue. But she thought that the Air Force had a little bit better quality of life, and that was reinforced as we were driving across the country from Seattle to my first duty station in Florida and stayed at some Air Force bases. We walk into this beautiful hotel room, and my mom was like, "Wow, you've made a good choice with the Air Force. This is much better than the Army accommodations. I bet their food is better too."
What are the primary responsibilities and duties of an Air Force public affairs officer?
So as Air Force Public Affairs, I was basically the face and the mouthpiece of my home base. We were essentially PR for the military. So trying to share the stories of what's going on, trying to keep folks informed. So the base community where I was stationed, Hurlburt Field in Florida, was a community of 8,000 people. So that's service members and their families. And public affairs was charged with keeping them informed about things happening. And, that's down to, we've got a new schedule for the base gym to, we had a fallen service member and there will be a memorial service on this day, to, there's an active threat or a hurricane barreling toward the Gulf Coast. So these are the procedures you need to follow. So focused on communicating with our internal audience as well as media relations and community relations, just trying to keep people informed about what's going on, what we're doing, and with the overarching goal of building support and understanding of our mission.
And what qualifications and training did you have to become a public affairs officer?
So in addition to my basic military training, for just to qualify me to be an Air Force officer in general, I also went to a specific public affairs training, which focused on journalism, media relations, how to escort media representatives, how to effectively translate what we're doing, what our mission is, what folks are saying into something that the general public will understand, and also how to train other people to effectively engage with the media. So that is kind of interesting, actually, to be sitting on this side of things, because this interview that I'm doing with you, this might be something that I would be, preparing a base commander to go through. What are the key messages that we want to focus on? Here's some questions that they might ask. How would you respond to these? If there's a controversial issue happening, be prepared to discuss that and bridge to this thing in that way. So as you look at politicians doing press conferences and those kind of things, the tap dancing that they do, and focusing on this mission over that one, and how do we get from here to there? Those were the types of things that I was trained to help other people navigate.
So you answer the question you want to, not the question you were asked.
Exactly.
There's a
And
fine art to
I
that.
admit it has been a conscious effort for me to kind of be more open and vulnerable and say what I really feel, as opposed to kind of doing that soundbite dance.
So you talked about your activities you handled while on the base. What types of media activities did you handle during your deployment to Afghanistan?
It was a lot of similar type activities, but in a more kind of controlled and high stakes environment. So when I was stationed in Florida, it was a very military friendly town, and we had our local military beat reporter who would come on base regularly and who we were all on very good first name basis with. And then we would have national media folks come in, or they filmed one of the Transformers movies, some scenes on base. So we were involved in essentially babysitting them for that endeavor, and hooking them up with folks to be extras and that kind of thing. In a deployed environment, it was all kind of hyper focused. So we would have a handful of embed reporters who would come and spend a few days with us. I was stationed on a small forward operating base, And my particular unit was a provincial reconstruction team. So very much focused on the nation building, working with locals to try to build up their infrastructure, their capacity for governance and healthcare and basic services to provide to their people. We were stationed with other units who had different focuses. There was an agribusiness development team that was working on building up the agricultural infrastructure in the local area. And then there was the more traditional kind of kinetic focused unit that engaged in combat operations when necessary. So we all worked very closely together. It was a very small base, less than a mile in circumference. So when we had a media person coming, we kind of tried to get the most bang for our buck and send them on missions that involved multiple units. So it was kind of a media share, for lack of better words. And it was, in a way that I hadn't experienced stateside, much more targeted. So we would very specifically send these people on missions that would help us communicate what we wanted to communicate. And by and large, that was that these operations are being successful, we're being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, we're taking good care of America's sons and daughters who are serving. And I quickly realized that that was not the whole story, and that's what the international and American publics and the Afghan publics were being exposed to through my job as the mouthpiece was not the full picture. And I got very uncomfortable in that role. I essentially was tasked to babysit reporters sometimes. We had one reporter come to our area who had written some stories that were controversial, not in that they were untrue, but just in that they revealed some things that wasn't entirely flattering to the military. Basically, that money had been spent for something that wasn't really serving the purpose that it was intended to. And that's a lot of that has come out in the last few years, that there's a lot of unaccounted for taxpayer dollars, a lot of money that was spent on construction projects that were very shoddily built, or we experienced some that were contracted to be built in one area, and then there was a tribal dispute or some kind of bribery going on that then led them to be built somewhere else. So all of these things, this very tangled web that we were operating in, and we were picking and choosing the most stellar examples to expose external folks to. And I got very uncomfortable in that role as information filter.
What were some of the main challenges you faced while serving in Afghanistan, and were those challenges different for women than men?
A big one for me was the disillusionment, and really just a harsh clash between my expectations and the reality of the situation. And part of that was being young and naive and very much drinking the Kool-Aid, thinking about, I'm following in my mom's footsteps, this mythical heroic woman, and I want to be a mythical heroic woman myself. And also just consuming all of these messages around me in the military and through the public affairs chain of information. Even the folks who we replaced when I came to Afghanistan, the unit that had been there previously, were just trumpeting all the success and the wonderful working relationships that they had with the Afghans. And it didn't take long to see that, again, that was not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, that it was a much more complicated situation and a lot of factors at play, and that we, in our role, had a very limited capacity to impact them in any kind of meaningful way. So I realized that very quickly into a 9-month deployment, and then had to kind of shoulder that for the rest of the time, which I think has been a challenge for a lot of folks in these recent conflicts. The questioning of what are we doing here, and is this meaningful, and am I doing this in the best way? And the reality is, in that situation, again, like we addressed earlier, when you're in a situation where you have to be concerned about at any minute potentially making life or death decisions and really focus on survival, it's impossible to distance yourself from that to ponder the greater, emotional, psychological implications of what you're involved in. Trying to do that will paralyze you and inhibit you from doing that important survival job that you need to be doing. So the body's natural coping mechanism in those instances is to just kind of shut down. And I very much did that. And it took a long time for me to be able to access those spaces again. But to your point of the gender dynamics coming to play, I was very fortunate in a lot of ways. I had a really supportive team. My team was about 80 people, and we had 7 women on our team of 80 people, which is actually a relatively high percentage in a combat zone. But the men were all extremely supportive and really worked to protect us. So I personally did not experience anything more than minor harassment, and I'm very grateful for that. I know that's not the case for many people. Where my gender was most apparent was going out on missions in the local area, which was a very conservative area of Afghanistan. Women still wore burqas locally. So all the women on my team, when we were out on local missions, we wore headscarves in respect for local culture. And in my role as an officer who was charged with communicating with locals and talking to them and understanding what was going on in their area and what their goals were, I had to interface with a lot of men predominantly because they were the ones in positions of power. And it became very, very charged because of my gender. So for example, we would be in a meeting at the governor's compound and kind of standing in a receiving line to welcome all of these tribal leaders and government officials. And in my body armor, before I took off my helmet, I kind of blended in with the folks around me. But as soon as the locals got close to me and recognized I was a woman, some of them would like step back and just skip right over me to the person beside me, not shake my hand. Some of them, you could kind of see them thinking through like, oh, I should probably shake her hand because, they give us money and support our security. So it should probably be nice. And then some were just bubbling over with excitement to see me. I was like this exciting anomaly that was gracing them with my presence. And actually got on the news. I got my picture taken for circumstances where I really had nothing to do with what was going on. I was just at a meeting as an observer. So again, that weird spotlight of being a woman that, could be beneficial when I needed to wield it, when I needed attention for something. But if I didn't want attention, if attention was not beneficial, that spotlight was still always there.
Let's shift gears on your other deployment. Not many people think of the Republic of Mali and certainly can't point out on a map. Why were you deployed there, and what was the culture like? And then ultimately, what was the experience like for you?
And I confess, before I went to Mali, I wouldn't have been able to point it out on a map either. I learned that that's where Timbuktu is located. Timbuktu is in the Republic of Mali. I was there for about a month, about 4 months before my Afghanistan deployment, actually. And the mission there was taking a brand new aircraft that we were just starting to use in an operational capacity at my base, and essentially using it as a training mission and also to train local forces. So the Malian forces, we had some Senegalese forces who joined us for some of the training that American troops were leading. And because I was at a special operations base, we had very highly trained expert soldiers who were in a role where they were mentoring soldiers from other companies. The CV-22 tilt rotor aircraft was the plane that we took on this deployment, and that it's now used by the Marines. It's at a couple different Air Force bases. It's really cool. When it first came to our base, there were actually a number of crashes on the road outside the base because it was just so cool to watch flying overhead, and people would get distracted and then rear end the person in front of them. But it has propellers that can it can take off like a helicopter because the propellers face up, and then once it's up, it can put them forward and fly like a plane. Very cool. Got to ride in it a couple times. Amazing, like roller coaster like experience. So I was there in a public affairs capacity, basically supporting the first operational use of this aircraft on training missions and on joint training missions with the local forces. And I had an absolutely incredible time. It was the first time that I had done something where I really felt like, I would sit at home at my base in Florida, like writing press releases in my air-conditioned office while I was watching, the Special Operations Forces train outside in the heat of the day, like literally carrying logs. This was part of their training. They would run around the base in the heat of the day carrying logs. And I was like typing on my computer and answering phone calls. And it just didn't feel like I was contributing in a meaningful way. So going to Mali and working directly with the local population and just being exposed to another culture and seeing how they saw the Americans and just working with them in a very close partnership capacity was so meaningful for me. We ran a couple of free medical clinics where folks would walk for hours to come and be seen by American medics, and anything from malaria to like a sore throat, or children dealing with malnutrition. So it was my first exposure to that kind of hearts and minds mission that the military engages in, and I just totally ate it up. And it was actually on the heels of that I volunteered to deploy to Afghanistan on a mission that seemed very similar, that hearts and minds, working with local population and trying to help them help themselves.
Obviously, you're a writer, but what inspired you specifically to write The Fine Art of Camouflage?
It didn't start out so much as a book project. It was really when I got back from Afghanistan, I had so many feelings and just a lot of just feeling unsettled and emotions that I didn't know what to do with. And the way that I've always processed those kinds of swirling thoughts and emotions is to write about them. I've always liked writing and kind of gravitated to that as a way of sorting through things and making things tangible. So that was really the early attempts at writing something that maybe in some form became this book, was just kind of purging that from me and trying to start to intellectualize it and understand what it meant. And it took it took 12 years, and going through my master's in fine arts program, where the beginnings of this book were my thesis that I was working on closely with some writing mentors and getting workshopped by classmates and having other people read my work for the first time to really start to shape it into something that wasn't just, me spilling my guts and totally navel gazing and raw like diary entries, but actually shaping it into something that other people could relate to and maybe find meaningful as well.
The big question, what did your mom think about it as you're writing it, and then when she saw the final product of the book?
My mom has been so supportive the entire time. My whole family is, and I'm really grateful for that. I know a lot of folks who engage in personal writing. It can be tricky because this is my story, but other people are inevitably a part of my story, and it's not their decision to be a part of that story. So you're writing about other people in sometimes very intimate ways, and that can be a tricky thing to navigate. But my family has always been very supportive of my writing, and both of my parents have read numerous drafts of this book, and I actually have a draft that they looked through here, and you can see all the sticky
A lot
notes.
of Post-it notes.
Those are all marking pages where they found typos or where they had questions or remembered something differently. So I wanted to be aware of how other people remembered things too, because of course, memory is fallible. And I wanted to include them in that process, especially my mom, who's such a big part of my story, and give them an opportunity to share their thoughts. And then that led to some other questions that I think helped the writing dig deeper into some of the things that I was only aware at level 2, and talking to my mom helped me dig down to level 4 or 5. So I'm very grateful that it became more of a collaborative experience with them.
Did you ever think it would take you 12 years, or were you at a point where you thought you'd never finish it?
I actually thought I finished it 8 or 9 times in that process. I had my reading to launch my book back in March at a local bookstore here in Seattle, and I wore a dress that I had purchased to wear at my book launch when I thought that was coming up inevitably very soon, and that was 8 years ago. So I've been at many stages where I felt like it's about to happen, and it has been harder every step of the way than I imagined, but I feel like the manuscript is what it needs to be now. It took this long to get there, but if you told me when I was starting out that it would take 12 years, I may not have stuck in it for the long haul. So I guess ignorance is bliss in that sense.
So I may be out of line here, but have you started a second book yet?
In terms of pondering ideas for another book, I suppose. Thinking about things is actually a big part of the writing process. It's also a very powerful procrastination tool that I wield very effectively. But the place I'm at in my life with a full-time job and twin 2-year-olds doesn't really afford a lot of space to, sit down and hash things out in the way that I need to kind of clear that brain space and have the creative energy to really start something new. But I think through things a lot, and I have quite a few ideas, and every once in a while I have a document on my computer that's just like writing stuff, and I just like, stick thoughts or sentences or themes in there that I want to come back to. And maybe I will, maybe I won't, but I really think that something has to be an obsession in order to carry it through a full-length project. Even, I write a lot of essays or op-eds, and even something like that, just the amount of mental energy and focus it takes to craft something, at least for me. I'm not something who can just sit down and pound out, brilliance in an hour. And even after 12 years, I don't want to call this brilliance, but it's hard won for me. And I just don't have the brain space that I would like to have to be able to do that. And I'm kind of, I guess I'm waiting for the muse to come and invade my brain in order to allow me to focus on my next obsession.
And while we're talking about it, please tell our listeners and viewers where they can find the Fine Art of Camouflage.
The Fine Art of Camouflage is pretty much available through any bookseller. So I always encourage folks to go to your local bookstore. If they don't have it on the shelves, then they can order it and have it to you in a few days. It's also available online at bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, and Amazon. And if you want to check out an excerpt, I have one on my website at laurenkjohnson.com, and K is spelled K-A-Y, laurenkjohnson.com. I also will be reading a section tonight at a virtual event with Matt Gallagher, who is an amazing, very prolific veteran writer, wrote a memoir about his time in Iraq, and his fourth novel coming out early next year, which blows my mind. He's not that much older than I am. So, if I continue at this pace, I'll be at that point in like 36 years or so. But should be a great event. We're gonna each read from our work and then chat about the writing process and about this weird dynamic of being a veteran in the post 9/11 era. So the information for that is on my website as well.
And again, that's laurenkjohnson.com. And again, K-A-Y is spelled, I'm sorry, K is spelled K-A-Y. And if people want you to come speak in an event, go through your website as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I would love to do that in person, virtually. Teleportation, whatever is available. Always happy to pop in. I have a contact form on my website, and I will get back to you as soon as I can, as I'm juggling my toddlers and life. Yes.
When you left the Air Force, you were diagnosed with chronic adjustment disorder. We hear a lot about post-traumatic stress, or PTS, and actually today is National PTSD Awareness Day. What are the differences between post-traumatic stress and chronic adjustment disorder?
Chronic adjustment disorder was my diagnosis when I left the military. You get an assessment to kind of, see what type of VA care you're eligible for. And my interpretation of it at the time was kind of like PTSD light. I didn't check quite all of the boxes to qualify for PTSD. And chronic adjustment disorder is basically a stress disorder that someone exhibits when they've been through a stressful situation. And I think it's interesting that the wording in the diagnostic manual is something to the effect of, the amount of stress that you experience or the impact it has on you is greater than could be expected from that experience. So like you're more stressed out than you should be, which is such an interesting concept for me, because like, how is someone supposed to respond to, like, what is a normal response to a very abnormal situation? Like being in a combat zone for 9 months is an abnormal situation. And of course, it's going to take you time to come down from that, hypervigilance, always being on, always expecting something horrible to happen. For me, I actually think in hindsight, what a better fit for my experiences is moral injury, which is a term that was not around when I first got back from Afghanistan and left the service. It's really just come into play in the last 10 years or so. And moral injury acknowledges that there's some gray space in, something that is distressing, that impacts you on a deep, emotional, psychological level, but it doesn't have that, stereotypical, traditional, what we think of as trauma-inducing experience. I wasn't in combat. I didn't have any friends who were seriously injured or killed while I was deployed. So I felt like I didn't deserve to struggle. And I felt a lot of guilt about that, which then contributed, of course, to my struggling. It became a self-licking ice cream cone. And moral injury refers to not necessarily that psychological injury of post-traumatic stress, or not a physical injury, but an injury of the soul. So engaging in activities or witnessing activities or allowing activities to continue that come into conflict with your morals. And for me, that was being the information filter and feeling like I was referring the Afghans to a broken system with their government. And like I wasn't giving the American people access to all of the information they needed to make informed decisions about the continued war effort. So that, to me, just left me very unsettled and feeling guilty. Was I doing things that I shouldn't have done? Did I send ripples with the things I was saying or wasn't saying? And what if people got caught in those ripples? And what if that then became a life and death situation? I always kind of protected myself, thinking my job isn't life or death. I'm just a public affairs officer. But words are powerful and messages are powerful. And I started kind of going down that spiral of thinking about, the secondary and tertiary effects of that. So moral injury, I appreciate that has become part of the conversation, and certainly not exclusively to the military either. There's actually been a lot of discussion about first responders and those at the front lines of COVID healthcare who've been dealing with these moral conundrums, wanting to help people but not having the resources or enough resources to help everyone, wanting to help people but not knowing how, or wanting to help people who don't want to be helped. So all of these things that really kind of hit you at a, deep in your soul level, I think are captured really well in the term of moral injury.
You talked about not being in a combat zone, but remember, the pen is mightier than the sword. Lauren K. Johnson, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I appreciate the conversation.
And I would be remiss if I didn't say thank you for your service, and I do mean that.
Thank you. I believe you.
And thank you to our audience for joining us for another episode of Next Steps Forward. For more details on upcoming shows and guests, please follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Chris Meek Public Figure, and on Twitter at ChrisMeek_USA. We'll be back next Tuesday, same time, same place, with our leader from the world of business, politics, public policy, sports, or entertainment. Until then, stay safe and keep taking your next steps forward.